Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here as always in the John Hope Franklin Center, and we are joined today by a very special guest, Timon West, who among other things is a Duke alum, well known as an activist, as an educator, as a founding member of the Deep Dickollective, a groundbreaking hip hop group. How you doing today, Timon?
I'm good. It's good to be back on campus and talk to you.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us here in the Left to Black studio. In another iteration of your career, you wrote an extraordinary essay in a collection of essays that was edited by Jeff Chang called Total Chaos. And one of the things I always took from that essay is you were reimagining or helping us to better imagine the early days of hip hop. You raised this point that we presume to know who these men were. What their sexuality was, what their desires were. We presume that, you know, somehow the ground zero for hip hop is heterosexual.
Right.
So that when we see all these other figures emerge, women rappers, gay rappers, right, where there are folks who feel as though there's an erosion of something of value there. Fast forward a decade, and we've all been kind of processing the stories over the last 6 months about Africa Bambaataa and his relationship with young men. And folks who take one tact, it's all lies. Folks are trying to demonize hip hop and the father of hip hop. And then folks, you know, because we are in a very different space in thinking about sexuality now, folks who are also like, why does that matter? Right? The illegality of having sex with boys, right, is one thing. But if he is in fact a homosexual, why does that matter in terms of, you know, what changes in regard to what hip hop is and what he might have built at a period of time? Do you feel as though you were prescient?
I mean, I think this sort of erasure of certain kinds of identities in hip hop landscape has always been really interesting and ironic, but I have to say it's also aligned with that same kind of erasure in history in general, right? Yeah. So the invisibility of the erasure of Bayard Rustin and civil rights, the erasure of certain people in the Harlem Renaissance movement, or even when some people even talk about black nationalism or black arts movement, the ability to imagine that without the presence of queer people, for me seems almost impossible, but for some people seems necessary, right? And I think there's this notion of competing sort of identities that somehow like affirming another identity dilutes your blackness. Right. I've been really playing with this term blacker, right? BLAQUEER, which for me is this acknowledgement that at the margins of blackness, like what really holds blackness together are some of these identities that have been pushed to the margins, that have been made invisible. Yeah. But when you look at the impact and the affect of those identities, they're often very critically important. So that if we can imagine that maybe Africa Bambaataa is a member of the LGBT community, whether he acknowledges it or not, I think that's very symbolic. It sort of aligns with this idea of blacker experience, right? And I also wondered to what degree might his orientation have manifested as it did in a space where it was compulsory to hide, compulsory to be silent, compulsory not to express and affirm. And so, you know, I see that, I see, you know, what's happening or what's been happening in the Catholic Church with priests, and it's like, there's something similar when you require people to repress and when you demonize a certain aspect of who they are, it can sometimes emerge in some really you know, interesting ways.
You know, we're in a really different kind of moment where you can have an artist like Frank Ocean, you know, who's kind of circulating. And it was a little ambivalent in talking about his sexuality earlier in his career, less so now. You can have a figure like Jaden Smith, who has not really articulated his sexuality one way or the other, but when folks read him, right, they read him a certain kind of way. I'm thinking about Young Thug's cover, you know, for Jeffrey. And you know, there's something that's kind of interesting about it, because you look at that cover, and when you think about how flamboyant early hip hop artists were,
Absolutely.
Right, whether we're talking Grandmaster Flash and Melly Mel and them African, you know, all the fringes and stuff. I mean,
it was like a hip hop remix of the Village People, really, when you think about it. Which I mean, historically, really aligns as a trajectory with like a lot of hip hop growing out of late disco culture, right, and house music culture. But again, that we get cultural amnesia around some of those moments, which is really interesting. Or even I showed when I was teaching a hip hop studies class at Humboldt State up in Northern California, some of the students had never seen Beat Street.
Right.
And before we had conversations around what was so gay or what looked gay, and they watched Beat Street and they was like
I'm confused.
Wow, like everything we said is supposed to be gay is like expressing itself in one of the seminal films of hip hop. So it's like this cognitive dissonance of like how can I call something that when this is in fact. So I think this moment, you're right, the current moment is really interesting. I think it's also resuscitating certain figures in hip hop, right? You know, Busta Rhymes was part of Leaders of the New School, right? They were in pastel colors, singing about lovely suburban experiences, not hardcore. You know, and so
early A Tribe Called Quest.
Early A Tribe Called Quest, right? You know, so it's definitely. I think it's nice to see some return of a diversification of Black male experiences in the hip hop landscape.
But that's a different landscape when Deep Dickollective hits. I mean, it's a distinct moment of hypermasculinity in hip hop. What was it like navigating that space at that time?
You know, I think the most interesting thing was the inability for people to see masculinity show up shamelessly affirming queerness to the extent that people didn't believe we were actually queer, right? You know, we had one member that was partnered to a woman but identified openly as bisexual. We had a trans man who talked about women in the raps all the time. So people were kind of like, I don't know quite what to do with this. And we did all present as masculine. I think a lot about what it means. One, when you can only see queer identity through an emasculation lens, right? Then when you see masculine men show up and affirm that, it seems parodic or strategic. So we had people quite often say, this is a gimmick, right? Like there hasn't been like a Black Afrocentric queer rap group, and so this is a way that y'all can sort of pull some whatever, but y'all not really that way, right? But I think that's also about the inability to imagine some brothers stepping in the cypher who can just toe-to-toe like out-rap you. And your smart bombs, the things that you most often use to put men down in a hip-hop context don't work. Because you call me gay, I'm gonna go, yep, right on. You know,
I always think about that scene, the first season of The Wire, when Omar is turning state's evidence, and you know, and Stringer walks into the courthouse, looks at them and goes, "Faggot," and Omar just looks at him and go, "What's your point?" it's like, what's your point?
Right, yeah. And I think it's also important to look at you know, early in hip hop, I had two kind of fascinations in my own sort of experience. One of them was with female rappers, so you know, loved everybody from Harmony to Moni Love to Roxanne Shante, like, and MC Light, and it was because of the insistence on creating space in a place that was supposed to be limited, right? The other one was really interesting, which is like white rappers, right? So huge Third Base fan, young Black teenagers, right? You remember that, right?
Wow.
They weren't Black, but you know, Everlast, right? Beasties, and part of that was because if hip hop can be porous enough to create space for these identities, that at some point in life maybe a DDC can emerge, and that really actually gave birth to that. What's really interesting to me about this moment, though, is that some of the more talented hip hop acts who identify as gay or bisexual are actually being silenced or disregarded when they present as masculine. Right, so there's an extent to which we can accept that this, you know, I almost say it can sometimes be a very tokenizing, entertaining, hyper effeminate or trans presence that allows real hip hop people to say, well, that's not real hip hop. I can just easily sort of dismiss it.
Right.
Or I can celebrate it in a way, oh, that made me laugh, or it's funny, but I don't have to take it seriously.
Seriously, right.
And I think that that's where DDC's presence really was disturbing for a lot of people, because it was hip hop, and you had to take it seriously, and wow. Like, there's like 8 of them. They're like a gay Wu-Tang. We don't know what to do with that, right? So that's been really interesting, and to the extent that I've had some rappers that are trying to enter the game say, maybe I need to camp it up, maybe I need to be more eccentric in order to, but I think that's also about something else. I think that's about the white queer community's discomfort with masculinity, and in particular Black masculine men, right? And I think DDC very overtly confronted racial anxiety, racial bigotry in the LGBT community. Right. And for a long time, when you had pride events, they would not book hip hop acts. Or if they did, they would ask, well, are there gonna be fights? Do we get extra security? Like, I mean, just, so, and this is especially resonating for me when you I was thinking about Orlando, and immediately after the heightened police presence in gayborhoods, or in the gay neighborhoods, at the gay clubs, and how in the minds of some people they felt more safe after Orlando, whereas me and my homies, when we walk up to the gay club and there's like a bunch of cops around, we're like,
ain't no difference, right?
I don't really feel safer.
Right.
So I think that it's a real complex, matrix of identities, what's safe, what gets defined as safe.
You're visiting North Carolina, of course. We're in the midst of conversations about House Bill 2
right.
at this moment. Do you think, and how do I want to phrase this? Because it is one of the most least progressive, right? I mean, it's regressive politics. And when we look at the Black church in this moment, in this space, and you look at someone like Reverend Barber, Reverend Barber is like the only Black minister in church in North Carolina. I mean, if we're gonna be honest about this, he's the most well-known one, right? But the rank and file is not filing in behind Reverend Barber in this. What does it mean to have to triangulate these politics? On the one hand, to challenge white supremacy and how it thinks about gender and sexuality, but also have to do that at home base also.
Right.
And I think that's, just looking at the arc of your career, I mean, that's something that you've done consistently and trying to find that. What does that look like in 2016?
And I'm a preacher's kid as well. So, it's interesting because I think, the Black church has its own erasure, right? And I think it's even more ironic and sometimes even insidious, right? When Black churches, when the Black gospel music industry insists that there is not an LGBT presence, and it's just like, come on, now. Like really, like, and but what I find interesting about it, there are these alternative spaces, Black religious spaces, faith-based spaces that are starting to counter that narrative. So there's been an increase in the growth in Black LGBT faith-based, spaces. I mean, one of the more faster growing churches in Atlanta is a Black gay church. And I think that's because people are saying, like, I have options. Like, I don't have to go be in a space and be silenced. And I can maintain this connection to my faith and continue to be who I am and live as who I am. I
mean, it's the movement Carl Bean started 20 years ago, right?
I think what's really interesting about HB2, though, is everything else that the bill talks about that's problematic, and how this particular issue around bathrooms, which everyone has trans bathrooms in their homes, right? Somebody comes to your house, they use the bathroom. It doesn't have male or female on it. So like the concept of like, I can't use the bathroom where other people say like, okay,
like really? if it's a private bathroom, should nobody be coming in the bathroom with you anyway?
And if anyone's there for any purpose other than to use the bathroom and wash their hands,
regardless of your sexuality, that's a problem.
Period. Right. So it's really a distraction, and I think about it as I actually started to read HB2 and find out about other kinds of things that were being sort of slipped under the rug. So it's really interesting when you talk about this idea of a politics that I think very deliberately on the part of the right tries to use sexuality as a wedge. An interesting stat that I was reading the other day, the census data, as well as a lot of demographic data that we get from other sources, indicates that the population of people, the group of people in the United States most likely to self-identify as LGBTQ is African Americans, right? When you see the LGBTQ community represented, quite often it is almost always white. So there's a disjunction between who we are and how we are represented. And I think some of that speaks to racism in the LGBT community, speaks to a certain notion and narrative of like, I think about gentrification, right? And sort of like this idea that like, you know, if you find some white gay people moving to the neighborhood, that's like how gentrification gets ushered in, right? Without problematizing the other aspects of how that's happening,
whiteness,
right?
Right.
And white privilege, right?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, to complicate these discussions, these narratives, to kind of work on both sides, right? Black homophobia, you know, racism in the LGBT community. You know, I even thought about the erasure of the fact that Orlando, those are people of color.
Yeah.
You know, Latinx and Black folks.
Right.
And interestingly enough, almost a year to the date from the time when 9 Black people were killed
in
Charleston, a very different response to the 9 Black people who were at the gay club, right? And I thought that was interesting because it was 9. That were Black. So a really interesting, I think, opportunity to really challenge our community on that erasure, and also to really think through like, what is at the root of it? You know, at this point when it's just really almost just really hard to deny. I think about Chuck D's first comment. I remember meeting Chuck D as a freshman when he came to perform here, and Poor Righteous Teacher, and you know, here I was like on the verge of becoming the Black Student Alliance president, doing all this Black political work, and you know, he and Harry Allen were talking, and I remember some conversations like just really angst and discomfort with this gay topic, and I'm sitting there the whole time like, if only they knew, right? And in some ways that was really encouraging to me, because I was like, I have to assert this this narrative into this conversation that, you know, here I was leading an African American community at a predominantly white university, and yet that identity was being erased. So I think about Chuck D's comment about, well, Frank Ocean isn't a rapper, right? So when people tried to assert this presence in hip hop, or that there is some viability for queer presence in hip hop, oh, it's not really hip hop.
It's not really hip hop, right? Yeah. You're of course an accomplished writer and spoken word poet. What are you working on these days?
Wow, that's really interesting. A jazz album. You know, I think it's really interesting for
jazz
those of
and
us
spoken word.
I'm trying to figure it out. It's probably going to have a little rap on it, but it'll probably be mostly vocal.
Okay.
And I think I was encouraged to some degree when I was listening to De La's latest project.
Right.
You know, I think those of us who are golden era heads remember when there was no hip hop, or when at least it wasn't, you know, this huge thing that it's become in terms of the marketplace, and how we listened to everything, right? We listened to the white rock groups, and you know, the black radio, urban radio didn't exist in the way that it came into the 90s. We all listened to everything, and so you hear those influences in something like De La's project, and so I think I really want to kind of be a little more experimental and adventurous in the stuff that I do going forward. But then also for me, like, you know, I think about how hip hop artists have I would say reinvented, but I was thinking about, for whatever reason the other day, about Ice Cube and LL Cool J and Queen Latifah and the roles that they occupy, right?
Now, right.
Will Smith,
yeah.
right? I mean, just like the power and influence they have, which sometimes almost makes you forget they were just rappers at one
Ice-T.
Ice-T. Right. And so, you know, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to kind of look at that as exemplars for like having impact and influence, but how does that manifest also in a much more conscientiously social justice kind of way, and how are independent hip hop artists such as myself sort of forging space in the political space or in the social justice framework to say, hey, like, you know, at some point, like, you know, and part of why rap doesn't, you know, I don't rap as much as I used to is because I'm 45 years old almost, like literally, like that's what I'm trying to call the brothers from DDC back together because I'm like, when we were passing the mic, it was, you know, easier to, you didn't have to have a lot of stamina on stage because there was somebody else always moving around rapping. You could take a breather or go get you some water. So yeah, so that's real. That's real. But I also think about the opportunity to, I think as Black men, this idea of lifespan and just growing. I'm looking at your salt and pepper, and I'm sure you see like mine's coming in, and it's. But I think that's something to celebrate, right?
Yeah,
to cast the idea of aging and growing older
and the experiences
and being
that
around,
you can, and
right?
the experiences you can bring to the table because of it.
But when I talk to a lot of young, it's like, oh, like there's an anxiety about aging, and I think some of that anxiety is connected to narratives of Black death and just not thinking
Which is
beyond
so
certain
present,
points, right? Yeah.
We've been joined by Tim and Wes, well-known activist, educator, founding member of the Deep Dickollective, spoken word poet, and of course, favorably, a Duke University alum. Thanks for joining us, Tim.
Thank you, Mark.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.